Welcome to our presentation today on our Wild Sarasota webinar series. And today we are going to be talking about prescribed fire. I'm Dr. Catherine Clements, and I have two guest speakers with me today from Sarasota County, both Tony Clements and Jay Bailey. So I am the Ecology and Natural Resources Educator for University of Florida Ifas Extension in Sarasota County. And in my position, I provide education for youth and adults and assist our community with education and concerns about wildlife issues, native and invasive species. I also focus on the health benefits of nature and do in-person guided interpretive eco walks at our county parks and preserves. I have a background in environmental studies from the State University of New York in Buffalo, where I'm super glad I'm not at in this moment, where there's lots of snow. And I also have a doctorate of naturopathic medicine from Bastyr University in Seattle. I spent about 15 or so years living in Oscar Scherer State Park with my husband, Tony, until just recently when he transitioned over to Sarasota County. And we have 2 children and a whole slew of animals. So a little bit about our extension office, for those of you that aren't familiar with us. We are a partnership between Sarasota County, the University of Florida, and the USDA. There are actually extension offices associated with all 67 counties in our state. And the mission of our extension offices is to use the research and resources of the university to address the local needs in our county. And we do that by providing practical education to help our residents, professional decision makers, and others build a better future here in Sarasota County. Every county's extension office is a little bit different because our purpose is to serve the county that we're in. We actually have quite a large county extension office here in Sarasota, and we provide programming in all of these 6 core areas. So if there are any of these areas that you're interested in learning more about, please sign up for one of our classes or reach out to us at the extension office and we will be happy to help you. These are just some of the variety of programs that we offer. Up in the upper right-hand corner is the logo for the University of Florida Ifas Florida Master Nationalist program, for which I'm a lead instructor. And that's an amazing program that is an adult education program about our Florida ecosystems. Also, our extension offices often have Master Gardener volunteers. Here in Sarasota County, we have 200 volunteers or over 200 that can assist you with learning about gardening here in this interesting state of ours. So turn it over to Tony.
Hello everyone, I'm Tony Clements. I'm a manager too with Sarasota County Parks, Recreational and Natural Resources, and the Natural Areas and Trails Division. There's a list here of all the properties that I manage. Before moving to Sarasota County Parks, which I've been here now for about 7-8 months, I was at Oscar Scherer State Park for about 20 years in the various roles. 4 years before that, I was also at King County Parks, Blue Mountain Regional Wildland Park, which is just outside Seattle, as a doing wildland restoration and trail construction. Happily married to Catherine, and we have 2 children, and like she said, lots of animals.
And Jay.
Thanks. I'm Jay Bailey, and I am the mitigation officer for Sarasota County Fire Department. And my job here is to direct and oversee the prescribed burn and wildfire management program that we have here in Sarasota County. And we have about 45,000 acres of land that we oversee and manage, and up to about 20 sites. So I've been doing this for over 23 years now. The first 8 years I did it with the Florida Forest Service, which was at the time the Division of Forestry. I've been on over 1,000 prescribed burns and on over 500 wildfires. Also, in addition to the fire part of my job, I've been heavily involved in disaster management across multiple states, mostly in Florida, including wildfires out west, and then in the southeast, and then hurricanes. I've been on about a dozen hurricanes now. Flood response, and then most recently the pandemic response here in Sarasota County, overseeing the logistics for Sarasota County, which we basically ordered and oversaw the handouts of the PPE to different nursing homes and hospitals. So we made sure that people that needed the the supplies had them. I've been married since 2006, and I'm a father of 3 children, all of which are under 14 years old. So I'm very busy with those kids these days. But when I'm not busy with them and on fires, I'm active in the outdoors, mostly cycling, running. I love trail running. I love mountain biking, which I go out west for every summer. Snowboarding, surfing. So pretty much anything I can do to destroy myself outside, I try to do. That includes my fire job.
All right, thank you, Jay and Tony, for joining me today. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. And these are the things we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about the definitions of fire, some history of fire here in the Southeast and in Florida, some recent wildfire examples, a little too close to home, and some history of fire in Sarasota County, as well as prescribed burns or prescribed fires, how we burn, and benefits of prescribed fire as a management tool, which is why we burn. And then, of course, we'll leave time for question and answer at the end. So I'm going to start us off with some definitions of fire. So prescribed fire, which is what we're going to talk a lot about today, is defined as a carefully and strategically controlled application of fire by a team of fire managers under specified weather and other conditions that helps restore health to ecosystems that depend on fire. So there's a whole lot in that definition. There are the words carefully, strategically, there's the word controlled, there's a team, there's fire managers. It's not just anyone that does these. And then once again, those really specific weather and other conditions, and it's all about helping restore our ecosystems to health. So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about prescribed fire as sort of like a doctor's prescription for the forest. And so we're going to talk more about that as we go today. And prescribed fire is always carried out in accordance with applicable laws, policies, and regulations. And we used to call them controlled burns, but more generally now we call them prescribed burns or prescribed fire. And then wildfires are what we don't want. They're an unplanned, unwanted wildland fire. And usually the objective when we have a wildfire is to put that fire out in order to decrease risk to humans and their structures. A wildland fire is a fire that occurs in vegetation or natural fuel. So this could either be a prescribed fire or a wildfire. Excuse me, it's just referring to something that isn't a house fire, for instance. And then fire suppression is the act of extinguishing or preventing fire, which of course there are times when we want to utilize fire suppression, but I think over the history, especially here in our state and out west, we're learning that fire suppression is not always the tool we want to use. And fire requires 3 ingredients. So we have this fire triangle here. Fire requires oxygen, heat, and fuel. And these 3 components also can determine the behavior of the fire as well. And wildland fire behavior is affected by the weather, the topography, which is a little bit more important out west than it is here in Florida where there isn't as much topography, but definitely the type of fuel as well.
Thank you.
So fire has been historically just part of the Southeast region for thousands of years. And historically, fire was set by both people and by lightning. The Native Americans and early Europeans used fire to clear farmland, to improve hunting, to facilitate their movement, and to increase visibility and provide safety from neighboring tribes that they might be protecting their territory from. And you can see a picture here from Frederick Remington called the Grass Fire. And it is portraying that setting the prairie, for instance, on fire for one of these many reasons. So this is something that people have been involved in for hundreds and thousands of years, and that have also been a part of our natural landscape through the setting of fire by lightning. And you often hear about Florida being the lightning capital of the United States. Here's a map that indicates lightning activity. And you can see this is the whole world. You can see that there are some places in Africa that maybe get a little bit more lightning than us. But in terms of the US, Florida is that red hot spot where we are the lightning capital of this particular country. So we get lots of lightning strikes annually. And long before humans inhabited Florida, wildfires caused by this lightning spread naturally through our many ecosystems, like the historic longleaf pine forests that were throughout the whole southeastern plain, our scrub and scrubby flatwoods, and across our prairies like we have here in Mayaca. The plants and animals of Florida have adapted to these fires and co-evolved over time so that today many are greatly dependent on fire for their actual survival, which is sort of funny to think about plants and animals actually needing fire to survive, but that is the case here in our Florida ecosystems. About 6 of every 10 acres in Florida, nearly 22 million acres, are considered fire dependent. So let's talk a little bit about wildfires. So of course we hear on the news a lot about the wildfires out west, and you can see the yellow areas here are where the most wildfires occur. And then the darker the color gets, the least wildfires there are. So you can see, especially in southern Florida, high amount of wildfires. It's still orange in central Florida. We're right about on that yellow-orange border here in Sarasota County. So we are at high risk for wildfires, almost to the same extent as out west. So it's not just a Western United States issue. In fact, this is a picture of the 2016 Gatlinburg Chimney Tops 2 fire, which occurred in Tennessee. And in this fire, over 17,000 acres burned, 14 lives were lost, 2,400 structures were lost, and it was one of the most costly fires in the US at almost $1 billion in damages. And many large wildfires have occurred in the Southeast US over the last 10 to 15 years. And here's some of the history specific to Florida. In 1935, the big scrub fire in Ocala National Forest, it is the fastest spreading, or was the fastest spreading fire in the history of our entire country. 35,000 acres burned in 4 hours. In 1956, we had the Buckhead fire in Osceola National Forest, and 100,000 acres burned in just 1 day. And then our first Florida WUI fire. So what WUI stands for is the Wildland Urban Interface. So this is when we start having residential communities come up against more wild and natural areas. And we call that Wildland Urban Interface. And of course, with 1,000 people moving into Florida every single day, we are having more and more development and more of this wildland urban interface. And there is quite a bit of risk in that wildland urban interface, especially if there is a wildfire. So our first wildland urban interface fire in our state was the Palm Coast Fire in 1985, and this burned 250 homes. And what is really interesting in terms of fire history is then 13 years later, that same subdivision burned again. And in that fire, 44 states responded, 45,000 people were evacuated. And what they found was the same thing they had found 13 years before, was that ground vegetation and roof overhang vents were responsible for the loss of homes. So we hadn't really learned anything over those 13 years that was then applied to help that community be safer in 1998. And hopefully we have learned a lot since then. Our peak wildfire season here in Florida is generally in April, as you see in that area in the red oval. So January is that very beginning of that graph, and we're in January now, and you can see our wildfire season is not at its peak, but we are going to be heading into its peak. So wildfires can occur at any point of the year here in Florida, but they're really going to be at the greatest in April. And we're also seeing maybe, as our climate changes a bit, we're also seeing maybe a heavy year as well for wildfires. And just interesting to look at a satellite image to see that some of these fires are sending up smoke plumes that can even be seen from NASA satellite images. So in 2018, these were 3 different fires that were affecting over 2,000 acres in each of those fires. And you could see those from out in space. And although we are the lightning capital of the US, humans are actually the main cause of wildfires in Florida. The top 2 main causes being arson and then escaped burning yard debris. And just so you know, in Sarasota County, there is actually a burn ban on yard debris. You cannot burn your yard debris here. But what is fascinating to me is that even things like gender reveal parties have started wildfires. So there was a gender reveal party last year in Brevard County that when the firefighters responded, they found that not only were fireworks being used to reveal the gender of the upcoming baby, but they had also used some explosives and a firearm as well. And this sparked a 40-acre wildfire. And many of you, if you're from this area, might have heard about this last year. Well, now it'll be almost 2 years ago. During COVID, we had this interesting situation where people weren't traveling, and so they weren't renting cars. And the Florida International Airport down in Fort Myers were housing over 3,000 cars in a grassy field. And what they have now discovered is that the wildfire that started was because of hot exhaust from one of the cars ignited the grass underneath this field of cars. And of course, the cars are full of gas, so they started to explode. And there was a huge wildfire that burned over 3,500 cars. Here you see some response. You see the helicopter in the middle of the smoke plume there. So this was a very detrimental fire that caused a lot of damage and burned so many cars. So where are we today? So here are some maps. The map on your left is our observed fire danger indices from yesterday. And so yesterday, everything compiled together, they make this map. And in Manatee County, the risk of fire was actually very high at a level 4. And our Sarasota County, we were low. And then they also project for today. So our projection of fire danger for today makes most of the state in the moderate range. And of course, that changes with some of the parameters like weather. And once again, we're right at the beginning of when our season is going to start to peak for wildfires. So it's not surprising that we see a map that's more green and yellow. And then this map will become more orange and red as we start to continue into our dry season and into that peak wildfire season. This is also a map that indicates current wildfires. So there aren't very many. There's one in the center of the state that's, it was 95% contained on last report, which was last week. And then there are just a few other reported and also contained wildfires. So the brown and black are contained and controlled. Those couple green dots are reported fires that we haven't gotten exact data on yet. So only one active wildfire that we are aware of in our state currently. Whereas this is a map from the Florida Forest Service, and this indicates the authorizations that have been issued for today. The purple are pile burns and the green are the prescribed burns. So you can see there is a lot of authorized burning being done by humans across our state. And these are all the ones that are being done by people that are trained burn managers under a prescribed burn authorization and a specific plan, which Jay is going to talk to you about in just a minute. And then I'm going to finish off with just talking about how, after we've talked about all of this wildfire and how we're the lightning capital of the United States and we're going into peak wildfire season, one of the ways we protect ourselves and our structures is what Jay and Tony are going to talk to you about is prescribed burning. But we also want to educate ourselves and our neighbors. If you live in that wildland urban interface, You can also do something called firescaping, which I also teach classes in. And firescaping is a type of landscape that creates these zones from Firewise USA that minimizes risk to your structure by how you landscape around your structures. And so there are very specific things that we try to do to help minimize the risk in case there were a wildfire coming near your structure. So I'm going to turn it over to Jay now. He's going to talk to you about the history of fire in Sarasota County.
All right, so just kind of a history as it relates to fire. I think most people have a pretty good understanding of this, but obviously Florida was not developed heavily until more recent history. So really into the 1900s, early 1900s, it started, getting a lot more development in the 1920s. But prior to that, the landscape was pretty sparse as far as people go. There were no streets. There were very few homes. So what would happen was you'd get a fire, let's just say in the middle of the state somewhere, maybe near the Peace River. You get a lightning strike that would strike in April. And over the course of the next few days or weeks, it would advance slowly across the landscape, eventually reaching the Gulf of Mexico or the Bay or whatever waterway it hit. It may have gotten rain on it, which put it out. It may have hit a waterway and kind of suppressed, or it went out slowly or slowed down. But the point is, there was nothing to stop it. These fires would just naturally work its way across the landscape. And that happened every 1 to 3 years in this part of Florida. Some of the habitats burned, up to 8 years, but it burned regularly. So this is the same area. You can see it's Lemon Bay Park, which is down in Inglewood. It's a Sarasota County managed park. So all that area to the east of it and to the north of it has homes now and streets. So those fires that may have occurred well to the east of it or the north of it no longer make it there because there's houses in the way and streets. They act as natural, or not natural, but they act as barriers for the fire. Also, fire suppression. We have fire trucks now. We have fire departments everywhere. So when we do get a fire, we usually put it out. So what's happened is these areas that used to get fire all the time no longer get that. They no longer have the fire intensity or the fire regular fires that we used to have. So that vegetation has become very overgrown. Areas where we used to have sporadic pine trees and 1 to 3 foot growth of shrubs and a lot of grasses now has become dense pines, overgrown shrubs, and very little grasses. So the landscape itself has changed dramatically. This just kind of puts it in perspective. It shows the 1950 residential area that's in blue. The blue dots is where the concentration of the population was. Was it 28,000, did I say?
Yeah.
28,000 people. So here we are 70 years later. You can see how much has changed. So the projections to 2045 show a significant 25% increase. And I think anyone that's lived here any amount of time, even if it's only a year, has seen the population growth. And obviously it goes in spurts. We've seen decades where we've had a lot of growth and then ones where we have not, but overall it's been growing very, very rapidly in Florida. And this shows the developed versus undeveloped in Florida and the trend to 2070. This is the projection of what's going to be developed versus not developed. So we have a lot of protected lands, especially here in Sarasota County. I think Tony's going to speak more about it in a few moments, but we have roughly 45,000 acres that Sarasota County itself manages, not to mention the state parks. We have 2 state parks within Sarasota County. We have a state forest. So we do have a lot of government managed land, as well as still a lot of ranch land that's privately managed and owned. So kind of going back to what I was talking about a few minutes ago, was the result of this fire suppression and these developments and the roads. It's led to a major degradation of the ecosystem, and also an increase to damaging wildfires. So the fires that we do get now, we still get the same amount of lightning strikes we used to get. But now the difference is that when we get these, they're gonna be a lot more devastating, a lot more intense, a lot harder to manage and control. And that, going back at that picture, just to let everyone know where that was on the Carlton Reserve in 2001. And that was a lightning strike fire. It was on Mother's Day weekend. So how do we burn? So Catherine kind of mentioned this a little bit, but we develop what's called a prescription. And this is something that's required that when you burn each morning, you have this in place. This is something that we work on well in advance. We work on some of these areas up to 3 years ahead of time. We know where we want to burn 3 years ahead of time. We don't know the exact date, but we know generally when we're going to burn it and the conditions we need to do so. So within this, we have a group of goals and parameters that are in place and a plan of how we're going to execute the burn. So it includes all kinds of things. It includes weather. In our program here in Sarasota, we use roughly 14 different weather parameters that we have to have in there, and they have to be met each day. And if those parameters are not met, we don't do the burn. Additionally, we have someone on scene during each burn that is taking a weather reading. So we know within half an hour if the weather changes at all. And if any point during that burn, the weather changes and we don't like the way it's going, we cut the burn off and stop it. But these prescriptions show, where we're burning. It has a detailed description of the stand and, the description of the vegetation that we're burning, the size of it. Includes a pretty detailed map of the area and the surrounding area, not just what we're burning, but the area that's adjacent to it. So if we have any issues, we know what's next to it. We have a briefing that we go through with the crew, make sure we have everything in place, make sure everyone has their equipment with them and all the trucks are operational, that kind of thing. Each area that we do in Sarasota also has a score. Catherine kind of talked about Firewise. We actually do what's called an assessment, a Firewise assessment on each of our sites. So we know the threat of wildfire in that area. And if they're too high, then we may do something else besides fire. We may use mechanical treatments in there, which I think Tony will get to in a few minutes. But it also is something that we get authorization from the Florida Forest Service each morning. So once we have our plan in place and all our ducks in a row, we call them up and let them know that we're going to be burning, and they grant us authorization so that they know we are burning and where we're going to be. We have in that plan, we have a medical plan and a radio plan as well. So we know where each crew member knows what radio channel we're going to be operating on, the chain of command, so who to report to for each person, and then a medical plan, where if something happens where someone's injured, that we have a plan in place to get them treated either to the hospital or on site. And I kind of mentioned this, but the plan, initially is developed years in advance, and then as we get closer to the actual burn date, it gets narrow, and we refine the plan even more. And that just shows the medical plan to the right, and then the weather page to the left. Today we had the weather was borderline on a couple of our parameters when we did our burn, but they all fell within. There's times that the parameters are very close, but they're well within the range, but they're close, and we decide not to do the burns because there's too many parameters that are too close. So sometimes those different parameters add up to the point where it makes it unsafe for us to burn. And we're looking for reasons not to burn, and it sounds kind of funny to say that, but we're always looking for problems that might arise ahead of time, so that if something does happen, we cover ourselves. So this shows us meeting up ahead of time. Prior to the burn, once we're on site, the burn boss, who's there's two of us in Sarasota County, for Sarasota County land, that actually boss the burns, and either one of us will lead the briefing. We let the crew know all the things that are in the prescription that I showed you, and let them know what the plan is, who's going to be doing what equipment's going to be used, what radio plan we're going to be using, the medical dilemmas we have. And then we go about the burn. But that briefing we have in the morning is the final step before we actually put fire on the ground. So each agency has different requirements to be on the burn teams. Ours are different than some other agencies. And then if you're in the private world, they're going to be much different. But for us in Sarasota County, we require that everyone on our team's trained. We send them through the minimum wildland firefighter training course, which is called 130, 190, where they learn about different suppression methods. They learn about the weather that's important to prescribed fire and wildfires. So everyone is certified to the state and the federal government to do these. And then additionally, most of our crew members have what's called the Florida Prescribed Burn Manager certification. And that's what you have to do a certified prescribed burn in the state of Florida. And then we also have our annual refresher classes that we mandate for each of our crew members. So, and on those trainings, we go through all our equipment, make sure everyone is proficient in operating them and making sure that they're proficient in all their safety needs. So we have that. It's all mandatory. And then a bunch of our crew members also partake in a bunch of other trainings that are relevant. So for instance, I've had there's several levels of the weather classes. I've had up to 490, which is the second highest one they have. And then a lot of our members have had the same. So obviously weather is a big, important part of our job. So we use a lot of different equipment on these burns. These are two examples here that we use often. We use what's called a type 6 brush truck, which is the one on the left, which is it can be between 200 and 400 gallons of water. It's basically a pickup chassis, a large pickup chassis on it that carries that water that can get in and out of small places, tight, narrow trails, that kind of thing. It's not too heavy. You can't take it too much off-road except for trails. Can't take it off into the rough or anything. Conversely, you have the truck to the right, which is a bigger brush truck that are military excess trucks that we have acquired from the federal government and the state. And those can go off-road into a lot of different terrain types. And those typically have a little bit more water capability, up to 600, 800 gallons usually. And those are ones that they're harder to operate because they're bigger, but they do offer a lot more water for us. We also sometimes have other agencies help us and assist us. We have the Florida Forest Service we work with a lot, and they'll bring out heavy equipment, bulldozers with a plow, where if we have an escape, which is something we strive not to have happen. And I'm proud to say we haven't had an escape in this program's history in over 20 years. We've also never had notice of violations on us or any loss to property or property damage from a prescribed fire. So that's something we're very proud of here. But we sometimes do have the Florida Forest Service out there with us just to make sure that if the fire does escape, that they're able to plow a safety line around it to make sure it doesn't go any further than our property. So operations, once we move into the operations phase, which is actually putting the fire on the ground, we usually start out with what's called a backing fire. You can kind of see a graph here of it. And if you see on the left, there's a road up to the north and maybe a plow line, which is from heavy equipment, put the line in, which basically takes the vegetation away and takes it down to mineral soil. And those are what we use to contain the fire. So we use a variety of methods to put fire on the ground, but we always have something that is containing the fire. Sometimes we use natural barriers. So just the other day, we did a burn where we had a hammock, which is an oak area of heavy, dense oaks, which fire doesn't typically carry through. We used that to hold the fire. So we knew that the fire wouldn't carry through that. So that was one side of our fire. So I mentioned the test fire. That's the first phase we do of the operations after the briefing. And that's where we put a little bit of fire on the ground in an area of vegetation that's representative of what we're going to burn throughout the day. We want to make sure that the wind is carrying the smoke in an optimal direction, the direction we hoped it would. We want to make sure that the vegetation's burning and it's not too wet and not too dry. We want to make sure it's burning at a level we're comfortable with. And we just do a small area that we know we can put out quickly if it's not cooperating. So that's what we call our test fire. And then we typically, and this isn't always the case, but we typically start with a backing fire, which is to establish what we call black line in a buffer area. And that's where the fire moves against the wind. So it moves very slowly. You typically have lower flame heights, and it's a lot easier to control a backing fire, and it creates just a bigger buffer area for us. And once we have that black line established, we use different techniques to get the fire in there. You know, we have once that buffer is there, you can be a lot more aggressive with your firing techniques. So sometimes we'll use a head fire. Sometimes we'll use what's called strip fires, which are several smaller head fires going through there. We use what's called point sourcing, which are several just well-placed small fires throughout the zone. You see some agencies, especially down the Everglades, where they're doing humongous zones of 100,000 acres at a time. They're using helicopters, and they're actually dropping the fire out of. They look like little ping pong balls, and they're dropping them out of that to ignite the fires. And that's in areas, they use that in areas where it's a lot more remote and you can't get a person in there to do it. So once the fuels have burned out, and just to kind of go back a little bit, what I refer to as fuels is vegetation. So basically anything that's vegetation, we consider fuels. Once the fuels have burned out and the objectives, ecological and fire management objectives have been met, we start doing what's called Mop-Up. And that's just making sure that any of the heavy smokes that are left over are out, are cooled down. We want to make sure that the line, the perimeter, where the biggest danger of the fire escaping is cold, and that there's nothing smoking or hot on that fire line. And that anything, if we have trees that are tall that have fire, way up in them, we want to make sure that those are out. So that's what we call Mop-Up. And that's usually, in a lot of cases, the longest part of the fire is the Mop-Up. So just to give you an example, today we finished our firing operation at about 5 minutes after 12. And my crew is still out there mopping up now, and they'll probably be out there for another couple hours. A lot of that just involves monitoring it to make sure that there's no flare-ups anywhere. So this is what I just mentioned about monitoring. Once the burn is completed, we often monitor these areas for several days. If it's super dry out, we monitor them for longer than that, sometimes up to a couple of weeks. We had a burn we did a couple of weeks ago that I just checked yesterday, and it was 2 weeks ago, just to make sure everything was still good on it and there's no new smokes on it, to make sure the containment was still met. We put a lot of emphasis into smoke impacts, and we want to make sure that residents are not impacted by our smoke from our fire. And if they are, it's as limited as possible. It's almost impossible to make sure that there's no smoke impact at all, but we try to reduce it as much as possible. We do that by doing smaller burns, and making sure the weather is ideal, make sure the wind directions and pushing away from the majority of the houses. Sometimes the smoke impacts that we get and the complaints we get are actually from fires a long way away. We had one a couple weeks ago that was from a fire that was actually in DeSoto County, and people were complaining to me that my fire was putting smoke on their house, and we weren't even burned that day. It was just, literally 25, 30 miles away. The smoke was coming down on them. So we mentioned, prescribed fire a lot, and that's our main tool. But I like to think of this program as a fire management program. And you can kind of see in the rearview mirror, someone lighting the fire behind this brush truck, and they're making sure that the fire stays within the line. It's a kind of a cool photo, we thought. But we do more than just put fire on the ground. We know we're going to get wildfires. Last year, Memorial Day, we had what turned out to be the biggest one we've had in Sarasota County in many years. And the reason it got so big was we let it get that big. And I know that sounds funny to say, but we knew that the area to the north of it, we burned about a month prior. In the area to the west, we burned about 2 months prior. So we knew, based on the weather, it wasn't going to go very far. We knew there was only a couple of areas we needed to protect and make sure that it didn't escape. And that's what we did. We actually went in and lit off one side of the fire along a trail because we had good access to it. We knew we could put our brush trucks down there and just watch it and make sure that the fire didn't get out of control. So it got much bigger than it would have probably historically, but we think that that's a good progress in showing that the management techniques that we've used over the last 20 years are starting to pay off. We don't think that it's always important to put a person in there to try to suppress it. There's a lot of danger involved with putting these fires out. We know if there's no houses impacted or residents impacted and there's no safety concerns to the public, we want to get to the point where we're allowing some of these fires to burn themselves out or burn to a natural area or burn to a previous burn area or burn to a fire break. And that's something you're starting to see across the country. In California, they had I think it was the two biggest fires they've had in their history in the last 2 years. And they both were huge. And in a lot of cases, they just allowed the fire to burn because they knew they weren't going to be able to put it out easily. And it didn't make any sense to put people in there to try to suppress it. It's very expensive to put fires out and very dangerous. A lot of times it's most efficient to let it burn to a natural area. So that's the goal. Our end goal here in Sarasota County is to let some of these fires that do naturally occur burn in the natural areas and maybe get a little bit bigger than they would normally. But at the end of the day, it's better for the ecosystem to let these fires happen as long as there's no threat to the public. All right, I'll turn it over to Tony.
All right, everybody, we've talked a little bit about what prescribed fire and wildfire is, and we've talked a little bit about how we burn, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about why we burn from a land management perspective. So first, I want to reiterate the benefits of prescribed fire. As you know, it restores and maintains natural communities, improves and maintains habitat for fire-adapted plants and animals, and encourages growth of fire-adapted plant species, and even can help manage invasive plant species that we have here in Florida. Reduces fuel buildup and chances for severe wildfire, therefore protecting our communities. Provides beautiful areas where we can enjoy wildlife and scenery, and improves recreational opportunities, and is hands down the best tool for restoring fire-dependent habitats across the country. So let's talk a little bit more about fire-dependent plant communities. I think Catherine had mentioned within Florida, 6 out of every 10 acres, so about 22 million acres of Florida is fire-dependent. So if you look at some of these maps that we have here, these are the ranges for some of these different plant species. So we have the more of a pinelands up on the left, and then we have a pine lily on the right. So if you look at where these species have been over the years, that kind of can also tell us where fires also have been over the years, because really you can't have one without the other. Also, not only the plants and plant communities or habitats, you've also got to look at the fire-dependent species that depend on them. And we've got quite a few just right here in Sarasota. So you can look at the ranges of these creatures that are fire-dependent species, such as the Florida scrub jay and the gopher tortoise, and see where they historically have been. So therefore, you know that fire also needs to be in those areas in order for these species to stay healthy. Because again, you really can't have one without the other. So within Sarasota County natural areas, we have about over 50,000 acres. And over 40,000 of those acres are considered fire dependent. So we actively manage most of that acreage with prescribed fire, because again, hands down, the best tool we have for managing these fire dependent plant communities.
Yeah, no.
So within these 40,000 acres, there are several different plant communities, and each one of these plant communities, and sometimes even within each one of these plant communities, you have unique fire frequencies, or what we call fire return intervals. So each different plant community is going to have a different fire return interval. And that's one of the ways we manage our property, is by looking back over time to see how Mother Nature had managed these properties, and we just try to mimic that the best we can through prescribed fires, and like Jay mentioned, managing the wildfires that we have in Florida and Sarasota County. So I want to focus a little bit more on one of the parks that Jay mentioned earlier, and that's Lemon Bay. It's one of our Sarasota County natural areas. Lemon Bay Park, it's about 210 acres. We break it down into 24 management zones. So those 4 management zones typically are also what we call burn zones. And within a park such as this, sometimes within each of those burn zones, we break it down even further where we have multiple burns within one management zones, because again, our safety is paramount. Safety for the crew they have on the fire lines, safety for the communities that live around these sites. So we want to make sure first and foremost that we're conducting these prescribed fires in a safe manner. But remember, if we don't do these prescribed fires, that's probably even worse, because that fuel will continue to build up in these plant communities. And it's not if, it's when there's a lightning strike and a wildfire. They're going to be much harder and much more devastating, not only on the plant community, but also on the neighboring communities to this park. So within Lemon Bay Park, the largest fire dependent habitat is pine flatwoods. And even within pine flatwoods, there's different levels of pine flatwoods depending on how wet or dry they are. And typically, fire return interval for a pine flatwoods is 2 to 4 years. So in a beautiful world, we would be burning each of these management zones on a 2 to 4 year rotation. And how we kind of come up with our annual burn plan each year. So each year, each of the land managers sits down with Jay and the fire mitigation team and figures out which zones, which management zones or part of management zones we want to have on the plan this year. So there's a lot of other factors that come in when we sit down and have that discussion. So on this property, we do have nesting bald eagles. So the eagles are typically around the same time that it's best to burn these areas, during growing season. So we have to consider the impacts to that eagle nest. And typically we would not impact that eagle nest with a prescribed fire. So we'd have to burn it away from that area and try to get fire in around that eagle's nest a time when they're not here and they're not nesting, because it's beneficial to those eagles if we do get fire in there, because if that continues, those fuels continue to grow and those pine trees can continue to get thick, then that's just going, when there's a lightning strike in there, it's going to devastate the tree with the eagle nest and destroy the eagle nest. Also, like Jay had mentioned, weather conditions are really, really imperative. If you look at this property, you can see that basically we can't really burn on any winds out of the west, because we would be impacting those communities to the east. So that again narrows our opportunities for conducting prescribed fire, because we have to keep within those narrow burn parameters that we put together in the prescription. And I think Jay and Catherine did mention the high urban interface. This isn't high urban interface property because of the community that's around it. So those factors also have to be brought into the picture when we're looking at creating our annual plan and figuring out how to best manage these properties. So one thing that happens, we call it backlog or outer rotation. So if we don't keep these areas within those fire return intervals, they move into backlog. So the further and longer they are in backlog, or the more years we don't burn these areas, the harder it is for us to apply fire back in these areas. And typically in these areas, it's not one and done. It's going to take multiple burns over multiple centuries to get these management zones looking how we want them. Because that first burn, once you're out of rotation, you want to do when the soils are still wet, when your fire behavior is going to be low, so that it's not going to be a destructive fire going through there. So many of those low intensity burns, it's going to take a while to get that habitat back to the way that you want it. We also use other tools to help reduce that fire behavior. So pictured here is a roller chopper, and we use these in management zones where the fuels are really, really overgrown and thick. This is one of the tools we could use. And what we're doing, the fields are all still there, but we're reducing the fuel arrangement. So typically on a fire, if you didn't roller chop, you may have flame lengths of 10 to 20 feet. Whereas if you roller chop it, you can get those flame lengths back down to 5 to 10 feet, where you can now actively manage that fire in a safer manner and still meet those objectives that you're looking for. And it's not that we just go in with this machine and just start chopping down the woods. We always will go in and look for any sensitive items, if there's gopher tortoise burrows, or anything nesting in that area. And we will flag those areas off to make sure that the operator of that machine stays out of those areas. And it also helps us to create those mosaic effects that we want on burns. Smoke dispersal is a really, really big factor, not only for the day of the burn, but it could be for the night of the burn and days after. Like Jay mentioned, that they monitor burns for days and days, because we want to make sure that that smoke is not impacting any of those sensitive zones, especially hospitals and roads and things of that nature. And of course, we want to be sure that we meet the objectives that we've set forth within our prescription. Again, because that's the whole point that we're doing these prescribed fires, is for the benefit of the natural areas and the plants and animals that live within them. So scrubby flatwoods, I wanted to point out, its fire return interval is about every 5 to 15 years, depending on what type of scrub it is. Typically, this scrub would burn where the winds are maybe 20, 30 miles an hour naturally, and the humidities are maybe 20 to 30%. There's no way that we could actively manage a prescribed fire under those conditions. That fire would cross lines and it would become a huge fire in a matter of no time. So again, in order for us to manage that fire appropriately, we do that zone preparation of the mechanical treatment. Sometimes we just do the mechanical treatment on the perimeters of the zones. Sometimes we do it for entire zones, and just leave out those sensitive areas like gopher tortoise burrows, or leave some higher fuels within that area, so we get more of that mosaic feel that we want in there. So now, after we've roller chopped, and you can see the picture above is pre-roller chopping, and the picture below is after roller chopping. And it's amazing to think that all that fuel is still there. You've just changed the way that it's arranged. So that zone to the top, in order to burn that, again, I need a 20, 30 mile an hour wind. I would need to have low humidities. But now that I've reduced that fuel down in the lower picture, now I can burn that with maybe 40 to 50% humidity with a 10 mile an hour wind, and burn it safely. So these are some of the factors that we consider and some of the tools that we use to implement prescribed fire in a safe manner. How do we know we're doing a good job? That's always a quick question. We can't just say, yeah, we burned. That's great. That's great for the environment. That's great for the ecosystem. We're creating biodiversity. So we do, within these areas, pre-burn and post-burn, we do plant and animal inventory. We don't go through and count every single plant and every single animal that are in there, but we get a broad perspective of what we have in there. And we also create photo points. So we do pre-burn photo points, we do during the burn and post-burn. And usually it's during the burn, 1 day after, a month after, 1 growing season after, 2 growing seasons after, and on and on and on until we burn it again next time. By looking at these photos and assessing that habitat will give us a better idea on how to best manage that area, because maybe we want to change our tactics a little bit. Maybe we want to change the time of year that we burn, because the time of year can be a contributing factor. Typically wildfires would occur during the spring here, spring, summer, and that's when we would naturally get those lightning strikes. So we want to mimic that process as much as possible. We don't always have the opportunity to burn during that window, but getting fire on the habitat within these on the ground and we meet our objectives is better any time of year than not burning it at all. So this is a photo of a pre-burn. It's pre-burn, but you can see that some of the zone has been prepped. So some of the fields along the edge have been knocked down so we can burn it safely, and so we can get that backing fire to move through the field, because now we've got a lot of dead fuel along the edge of the line. Excuse me. And here's an example of a zone at Lemon Bay. The top photo is about 1 month after the burn. And then the bottom photo is one growing season after the burn. And you can see that the native plants and animals in Florida, and plants especially in this photo, really flourish and really thrive once we apply that prescribed fire back down. It's almost like a natural fertilizer. It stimulates the growth. Many of the plants and animals I've learned to adapt and can only survive with that fire being reintroduced into these areas. Here's another one that I wanted to show you. So this is also at Lemon Bay, I believe. So this is 1 month after the burn, the top photo, and you can see new growth already coming up. And then one growing season after. You can see just in this photo that you can see it's a little bit more open. You're getting a little bit more grass response. So this probably was a growing season burn. Typically, if you do a growing season burn, you're going to have more herbaceous growth coming back in there. It's going to promote that biodiversity that you want. The more different types of plants that you have within this area, the more types of animals will utilize them. So this is a pine tree, and pine trees have adapted some really interesting ways of surviving a wildfire. And longleaf pine, they stay for their first few years of life in a grass stage. And when wildfires pass through this, the pine needles will actually kind of melt around the terminal bud, and that helps insulate and protect it. And that's one of the ways that these trees have learned to adapt to living in these fire-dependent communities. And also they've got really flaky bark. So as the trees get larger, you'll notice that as the fire crawls up the bark will peel off. And most of our pine trees that you have here are what they call self-pruning. You'll notice that the majority of them do not have lower branches, and that's so the fire doesn't get up into the crown of the trees. Saw palmetto was another interesting plant that we have an abundance of within these fire-dependent plant communities. Now, most of this, they've got these really interesting root system or rhizome, and that rhizome lives under the ground, and some of those rhizomes are over 400 years old, and after a burn, you'll get this new growth coming up. And these plants actually have oils in them that help them to promote them to burn, because a lot of people say, well, if it's green, it's not going to burn. But a lot of the plants in Florida have specific oils in them that allow them to burn more readily. And this was a prescribed fire at Oscar Shear State Park, and this was the same day as the burn. And it's amazing that the wildlife will just enter right back in. You know, there's a lot of nutrients on the ground. The deer are licking up the ash. They've got more open range now. The gopher tortoises are coming back in. The Florida scrub jays are coming back in and checking out the area. It's a lot more open, so they can catch their acorns in the soil. So again, these fire-dependent plants and animals are dependent on us doing these prescribed fires, because again, we're just mimicking that natural process that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. So I want to share this with you. So the more prescribed fire we have, the more biodiversity we have, and the more that we're protecting our communities. When the more prescribed fire we have, the less wildfires we have, the less fuel bill that we have, and the less risk to humans. And what I mean by risk to humans is our communities and our homes, and also the impacts from that smoke. Because if you're backlogged or you're having a wildfire and those fuels are heavy, you're going to get a lot more smoke than if you're doing a prescribed fire, and that pine flatwoods is in regular fire return interval. By a few hours after the burn, the fire is completely out and there's no smoke at all, because all those fuels are burned off over the years. I want to share a recent burn with you, and this was when I was at Oscar Shear State Park. If you look at that circle down on the left of the picture, that was the area that we were burning. And as you can see, it's right up against Willow Bend, a housing community. And we spent a lot of time building our relationship with the folks in these communities, and that's important. It's important that they understand the reason why we burn and how it benefits not only the plants and animals that they're going to see in their backyard, but also the how it's going to protect their homes by reducing that fuel buildup. So this was the burn that we did that day. As you can see, we went in and did some mechanical treatment. We reduced the fuels, and we're burning within less than 10 feet away from homes here. And because we did all that outreach, we wanted to get here and do this prescribed fire. And as you can see, the smoke is pushing that fire away from the homes and pushing back into the park. And by us continuously burning these areas, it's going to reduce that fire risk and that fire hazard even within these wildland urban interface areas. And it's amazing, this same day, we got so many calls from the neighbors about the wildlife that they saw coming back in their yard and how well the plants responded after the prescribed fire. And again, this was, I think, the next day after the fire. You can see we're right up against people's homes. We created that great relationship with them, and now they're advocates for prescribed fire because they've seen the benefits of it right in their own backyards. All right, thank you very much. I appreciate you spending the time with me.
So thank you for joining us today. We are going to have some time for questions and answers. And so now we are going to open it up for questions. I'm gonna turn on our volume so we can hear you guys. So feel free to put anything in the chat box and I will share that with our panel here, or you can also unmute. So we have a question in the chat. If dry conditions are bad, but rain promotes growth and fuel load, what is the right amount of rain?
So I'll start. I'm sure Tony can chime in too, but each site's different is the short answer. So some of these sites that maybe we haven't burned in a long time, they've gone a long time without being in a fire interval, those sometimes will burn closer to a rain event. A lot of it depends on how much rain we had prior to that too. So if we're coming off a rainy summer, let's say where we had a pretty rainy summer and we're in October, then even a little bit of rain will make it where we won't want to burn it. We won't meet our objectives. Conversely, if we're looking at something in spring, in April or May, and it's a site that maybe got rain the day before, and it's an area that's within interval, then we'll likely be able to burn it. A lot more grasses that dry up quicker versus the heavier vegetation that takes longer to dry up. That acts almost like a sponge. So I'll let Tony chime in, but that's kind of the short answer to that.
And we also, one of the factors that we use is that we have a drought index. And within our prescription, within each of our prescription, depending on what kind of fuels we have in that zone, we'll have a specific range within that drought index that we will burn in. So for that particular zone. So all those factors get looked at. It's not a cookie cutter prescription that fits for all, like say flatwoods. You're going to look at that specific zone. You're going to see, is it in backlog? Is it in good fire return interval? And all those factors are going to help you in developing the appropriate weather parameters for you to burn that area.
Okay, we got another one coming in. Okay, so I noticed that Manatee County was in the high risk category red and Sarasota right next door was in the low risk green on the map for yesterday. What are the factors that influence that difference in designation?
So a lot of it is based on how much rain we've had. Humidity plays a big role. So inland Manatee County likely had a higher or lower relative humidity predicted today, which plays a key role. The higher winds, another factor, but it's a formula of several different factors that go into play. But it varies from day to day, and they use what's called the energy release component, the ERC, to determine that. And it's basically how much energy is predicted to be released from a fire in that area based on the moisture levels. So it does literally vary day to day. Tomorrow we could be at the high level, Manatee could be the lower. So it's not necessarily a weekly thing even. It's just a day-to-day forecast they put out.
No, again, they just utilize all those factors like wind speed, humidity, drought index, all those things kind of factor in to give them formulated to give them that number to see what category every county falls in. And it can be different from sometimes the coast to the inland, because as you know, we get spotty rain showers where it could east of the 75, it could rain 2 inches, and west of 75, it can rain a lot less. So all these factors get looked at, and sometimes they just take an overall picture of the county, where even within the county it can be quite different. So it's just an overall look where it might not be that exact. Whereas like the KVDI, you can narrow down a little bit and be a little bit more exact off the forestry site, where you can only look for the county, but you can look within the fire districts, and you can even look within very specifics of a specific area of what that KVDI is, the drought index.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, it seems counterintuitive, but sometimes some of these sites, we want it a little on the drier side. Sometimes we want that higher wind, because when you get a higher wind, you have a more consistent wind. And more consistent wind gives you a better idea of where your smoke's gonna go. A lot of times on these lower wind days, I'll call them lower wind speed days, your wind is more variable. So you don't exactly know where the smoke's gonna go. So sometimes it's counterintuitive though. People think, okay, it's pretty windy out there, I'm not sure you should be burning, but sometimes those are the days we need to burn, because we know where the smoke's gonna go. We know that fire is gonna move that fire. We know the wind's gonna move the fire quickly through the zone, versus if we have light winds, it may take all day to do it. And we don't want that. We want that smoke to get up and out of there quick, so that we don't have residual smoke at night that could impact people. So sometimes people have the wrong perception of windy days. Of course, there's a fine line there. We don't want it too windy or too dry, but sometimes that's what we need. Sometimes we need those drier conditions to actually move it across the landscape.
And sometimes that's determined by, what your fire break is. If you're burning into the Gulf, you can be a little bit more aggressive. Or if you're burning into an area that you just burned a week ago, you can be a little bit more aggressive. Because sometimes it's about, you're looking at a few factors. You're looking at your fire intensity, and you're also looking at residency time. How long is that fire sitting in a specific spot? Because it can cook the roots, it can really cook a tree. But if you move that fire through quicker, it's going to have less residency time. Therefore, it could do less damage. So there's a lot of factors that go into play when it comes to prescribed fire and trying to meet your objectives and mimicking that natural process.
And I think that's a great point of today's presentation too, is just to understand how many factors go into this, how detailed it is, and how much time and effort you guys all spend to make sure that they're done as safely as possible for our community, as well as keeping those ecological objectives in mind as well. So Wayne also asked, what are strategies to reduce wildfire risk in urban areas where it can be difficult to do a prescribed burn? So
when we're talking about wildfire risk, wildfires are going to happen. There's nothing we can do to stop a wildfire from occurring. It's how we mitigate it. So we want to make sure the houses are protected. So that's the big thing that residents and the community can do, is protect their house, make sure that there's defensible space between their home and the vegetation that could potentially burn. You mentioned the gutters. Make sure your gutters are cleaned out. Make sure there's no pine straw in the gutters, pine straw on your roof. Building construction plays a key role into it. So if your house is made out of wood, maybe you have a wood shingle roof, you're at a higher risk. And Catherine's group can really tell people how to firescape to make sure that the vegetation around your home won't burn it. But at the end of the day, the big thing is, just because you're in an urban interface area doesn't mean there's no prescribed burning in that area. We can still do prescribed burns in these wildland urban interface areas, even the densely populated ones. It's just a matter of doing them maybe a little bit smaller, a little bit tighter parameters. So we don't give up just because it's in a wildland urban interface area. We still like to do burns in those areas. We do the vegetation mechanically as well, like Tony showed with the roller chopper. That doesn't alleviate the risk, but it definitely helps manage it. Whereas if you do get a wildfire, that vegetation is on the ground, it's a little bit easier to control. You don't have to worry about the flame height impacting the houses, but that's not a method that will end the wildfire threat. And it's not sustainable. Really, the only thing that is sustainable is prescribed fire. We
also, along our particular properties that are in these wildland urban interfaces, is we make sure we've got sufficient perimeter breaks. So between let's say the park, let's say Lemon Bay, and people's backyards, we want to make sure that we've got a plowed line or a grassy line or a line with no fuel. Usually you want it as twice as long as your fuel's along the edge, as wide. So most of our areas have at least a 20-foot fire break on our perimeters of our properties, where it makes sense, where we can do that. And that also helps us when we do have those wildfires in there, that now we've got a line of defense between the homes and the plant community that's burning. And also that's a factor we look at when we're sitting down to do those annual plans, is we're making sure that we're trying to also burn in blocks. So that way, you know, we're burning smarter and not harder when we can, and also factoring in those urban areas where there's a high risk for lightning strikes that could be devastating.
We're getting some thank yous coming in. So thank you once again to Jay and Tony for joining me today for our Wild Sarasota seminar on prescribed fire, and talking to us about how you guys work to not only take care of our environment, but also to keep our county and our residents safe. So we appreciate everything that you guys do.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. And all of you
Sure.
out there, thank you for joining us as well. And we look forward to seeing you at Firefest and at our next Wild Sarasota webinar. Take care.